And we're back. This is part two of Shame and Humiliation. I'm Neil Slobin, your you, and I want to continue with the rest of this. We'll see how far we'll see how many parts we have. I still don't know. This is part two. There may be a part three and a part four. We'll just have to look forward to that and see what happens. We left off the idea. Gilligan's idea is that um, uh, uh, shame is violence is caused by the feeling of shame and disrespect and powerlessness. And I wanted to make this point here. 2 points maybe at the beginning, commenting on part one. The feeling of shame is the feeling of the rejection of our desires to be loved. And because our desire to be loved is so important and so fundamental, and is the desire that gives us our identity, when we are rejected, we feel shame, we feel the disintegration of the self, that we come apart. And so because shame is so intense, as one would expect if yourself were disintegrating, and manifesting, expressing this feeling, because shame is so intense, we want to protect ourselves from experiencing shame. And we also want to deny that we are experiencing shame. We want to deny that we have this desire to be loved. And the best way to deny that is by being violent, is by being powerful in that way. If shame is an experience, the expression of powerlessness, violence is the expression of power. We have an experience of the rejection of ourself and the experience in violence of um, affirming ourselves, if I can put it that way. And so I just wanted you to get a better idea of what this feeling of shame was. It is in paragraph 25 in the reading, where Gilligan says, from a dynamic point of view, shame is a motive of defense against wishes to be loved and taken care of by others, wishes that make one vulnerable to the risk of rejection, that most typical of shame-inducing experience. And so if shame comes from vulnerability, and we don't want to feel shame because it's so intense, what we do is we conceal that vulnerability by its opposite, which is looking like we're invulnerable, which is being invulnerable. That is to say, being violent. You can't hurt me. Look, I can hurt you. So I want you to keep that in mind. And there's more that I could say about it, but that's enough for that. The other thing I wanted to just go back to, when I was talking about words that in terms of meant the same as shame and humiliation, I mentioned the word powerlessness, and I couldn't think of the paragraph. And the paragraph that powerlessness occurs in is on page 11, and it's paragraph 53. At the end of that paragraph, I'm going to let you find it. You should read the whole paragraph, which I don't want to do. But I think it's an important, powerlessness is an important concept. I think I said that. And it's become, I thought about it a lot more in the last 4 or 5 years. It feels to me like a very important feature of human experience. And a very important one. So, all right. Part two. Violence is caused by shame and our attempts to conceal shame, our desire to be loved. And I want to get to point 4 on the piece that the 1-page piece discussion points that I posted. Point 4 and I sort of said it at the very beginning of part one. Point four is if violence is caused by shame, why is it that not all people who are shamed are violent? And so let me frame that again. Gilligan is really saying something like this. He's saying, you show me an act of violence, I'll show you a person who's violent. I'll show you someone who is shamed. He's not saying, show me someone who is shamed, I'll show you someone who is violent. So there's a difference between people who are shamed and violent and people who are shamed and not violent. What is the difference? And it's a key part of this article. And that's point number four, and I'll read it. The problem that Gilligan must contend with is this: everyone is shamed or disrespected at some points in their lives, but not everyone is violent. If shame causes violence and everyone is shamed, why is everyone not violent? And I'm saying this point that Gilligan advances, I think, over other theories of violence. His answer is that shame is necessary for causing violence, but shame by itself is not enough. To become violent, the person who is shamed must also lack other sources of self-esteem. In other words, a violent person is one who has been shamed and also one who has run out of self-esteem, who has reached the bottom of his or her self-esteem. Both conditions, shame and no other sources of self-esteem, must be met to result in violence. So there is a tremendously important paragraph in part one of the reading. We have both parts now. And the paragraph I want to take us to is paragraph 31. I bolded it. It's on page 6. It's basically the only paragraph on page 6. And I think it's fundamental, well, part of this article. Whenever I'm teaching this article for a long time, whenever I think it's time to move some other article, something else, to give it up, this passage, this paragraph brings me back and says, you got to teach this. So I'm going to read this paragraph. It's paragraph 31. Gilligan says, it is true that creating, achieving, or producing things that are valued by other people can command respect and lead to honors, prestige, status, wealth, and power, and that this can be an equally effective and even more permanent means for warding off ridicule than violent behavior can. As Gerhard Pierce put it, and he's a psychiatrist, as Gerhard Pierce put it, the experience of competing successfully or achieving enough to attain one's level of ambition or aspiration can heal the wounds to self-esteem that shame consists of. Unfortunately, achievement and creativity require time, patience, talent, education, and some minimal degree of social and economic advantage, as well as sheer good luck. And many people and many peoples have not had such fortunate combinations of both internal and external resources, whereas violence always lies ready to hand, literally. Really important paragraph. I'm going to read the first sentence or two again. He says, it is true that creating, achieving, or producing things that are valued by other people can command respect and lead to honors, prestige, status, wealth, and power, and that this can be an equally effective and even more permanent means for warding off ridicule than violent behavior can. What Gilligan is saying is that we get our sense of self, our self-esteem, our self-respect. We get it in the terms that I've been using this semester. We get it by placing ourselves in the world. We produce things. We make things. Um, we compete successfully. And so, and this was also, by the way, a major point in the negative in our video, the video we watched, the Twilight Zone video, A Nice Place to Visit, because Rocky could not place himself in the world. That was one of the things that he was denied. And my claim there was that over a period of time, that he would lose his identity, he would lose his self. And probably not just his sense of self, although that's important, but he would lose his identity. Um, um, it would disintegrate. Um, but the positive idea that Gilligan is expressing in paragraph 31 here is that we we place ourselves in the world by achieving, by producing, by competing. And so, for instance, just to take one example, when you write a paper, since you're students, when you write a paper, you are doing something that puts yourself in the world. And when people like that paper, uh, probably mostly when your professor likes that paper, you feel good. You feel respected. You feel esteemed. Um, and you feel a sense of positive self. You feel some identity, and so that's a way of placing ourselves in the world. And I should also say that when the professor gives you a bad grade, you you feel a loss of identity. You feel a loss of self. That being upset that you, I would think, would feel in that case is feeling um, yourself rejected, of loss of identity, loss of self. So what Gilligan's saying is that we have identity by placing ourselves in the world, writing a good paper. We also have a sense of self by competing successfully on a team. That's what we do when you make a good shot, when you score a touchdown or catch a pass, or when you um, win the race. Those are when you score a goal. Those are all ways of competing successfully and achieving, as Gilligan says. It is true that creating, achieving, or producing things that are valued by other people commands respect and leads to honor, prestige, status, wealth, and power, and that this is an equally effective and even more permanent means for warding off ridicule um, than, than violent behavior can. The experience of competing successfully or achieving enough to attain one's level of ambition or aspiration can heal the wounds to self-esteem which shame consists of. So we place ourselves in the world. We place ourselves in the world, artistically. If you're an artist, by dancing. Um, I place myself in the world for some strange reason by teaching. Um, these are things that one would hope are valued by others. They give us standing in the community, and that standing is also the foundation of ourselves. And so, what Gilligan is saying here is just so important, that self-esteem depends on this ability to achieve something, to and what that is in the back is like placing ourselves in the world. One of the things that he says, or the last part of that paragraph, is unfortunately achievement and creativity require time, patience, patience, talent, education, and some minimal degree of social and economic advantage, as well as sheer good luck. And many people and many peoples have not had such fortunate combinations of both internal and external resources, whereas violence always lies ready to hand, literally. So when we are prevented from placing ourselves in the world through one of these uh, um, acceptable ways, a probably a better way of getting self-esteem, by achieving um, and having the community value that achievement. When we are prevented from placing ourselves in the world that way, an easy way, well, it's not easy, but the other way to save ourselves, and maybe we could think of that literally, to save ourselves, to save our identity, is through violence. You can't ignore me when I'm violent. I'm here. You see me. You acknowledge me. And if I can't be acknowledged in these other ways, of, of community affirming ways, um, I'll place myself in the community in a way actually that negates the community, that negates other people, but affirms myself. And so violence is this way, as he says, that lies ready to hand. One can always be violent. You can throw a tantrum. You can get angry. You can punch someone, um, and whatever other ways we are violent. When just to use my example, when in 11th grade I was mocked for my haircut. Um, I felt like my my identity was being negated, was being denied. As I love saying, here is destiny. I've now said it several times. And my challenge to this other kid, to a fight, was my way. You think you're going to negate me? You think you're going to deny my place in the community? I'm going to show you that I have a place in the community, essentially by pounding you, by negating you, and making, as it were, a stand. Um, and so, and so, I think this passage is very important. Um, and and if I were going to say you should think about one passage in depth, it's this one. And I think you can probably think of examples of on both sides, the affirming way that you place yourself in the community when you are valued and recognized, and the negating way when you place yourself in the community by through violence. Um, and so it's just an incredibly important point, and it matters for this fundamental, this major question that we have, which is, what is the difference between people who are shamed and violent and people who are shamed and not violent? And you can think of it in this way. I'm going to give you an equation. And if I had a board, I would write it on the board. But what Gilligan is saying is that shame plus the loss of self-esteem, or the inability to get self-esteem, equals violence. So it's shame plus one other condition results in violence. What is that other condition? It's running out of ways to place yourself in the world. You need both parts of it. Shame alone is not sufficient to cause to result in violence, but shame, and Gilligan is talking about probably extensive shame, maybe lives of shame, even developmentally, as you grow up, being the butt of jokes, being the scapegoat, being picked on, being bullied, maybe to that point, but shame nonetheless. Shame, um, plus um, plus running out of uh, the absence of other sources of self-esteem results in violence. And so the difference between people who are shamed and not violent and people who are shamed and violent is that people who are shamed and not violent have other sources of self-esteem, and people who are shamed and violent have run out of other sources of self-esteem, and so they gain their place in the world they gain their sense of self by being violent. Um, uh, so, so, um, so what Gilligan uh, uh, then is saying is is that most is that people most people who are shamed are not violent because most of us have other sources of self-esteem. And that when you see someone who is violent, what you are seeing is someone who is shamed, but who has run out of his or her um, um, other sources of self-esteem. But most of us have other sources of self-esteem. We achieve something. We're valued in some way. We're on a team. We do something creative. We've written a good paper. We have someone who cares about us, who helps us through this, that we know affirms us and will always affirm us. And so we have that person as another source of self-esteem. So all of this is psychologically important, and these are the psychological mechanisms of violence. And I've gone through it 8 times now in the last 7 minutes, so I won't go through it again. And that is point number 4. Again, though, with the emphasis on that paragraph number 31. But Gilligan then talks about the ideas that it seems, and this is historically true, that certain groups of or certain groupings of people are more violent than other groups of people. And so we get to point number 5 on this sheet where he says, finally, violence and aggression have meaning in relation to social and economic conditions in society because certain socioeconomic conditions offer the fewest sources of self-esteem, like poverty, being the victim of racism and discrimination, and are thus conducive to shaming or disrespecting the person and therefore to causing violence. That is, different social and economic classes in society expose people to different levels and intensities of shame, humiliation, and disrespect, and are therefore more likely to result in violence. So one of the things that Gilligan says, one of the things he points out, is that I'm going to stop this. All right, so I'm sorry for that, but I didn't want to make a total break, but I wanted to do a couple things. No other, put on a shirt, and I wanted to figure out what passages I was going to refer to, and the point where we left was that Gilligan says that there is a distinction among social and economic groups in the amount of violence that they express, essentially, and that he is going to talk about that. Well, he does talk about that in paragraph 5. Well, question number 5 on this single sheet that I've handed out to you, and I want to read that to you. He says, violence and aggression have meaning in relation to social and economic conditions in society because certain socioeconomic conditions offer the fewest sources of self-esteem, like poverty, being the victim of racism and discrimination, and are thus conducive to shaming or disrespecting the person, and therefore to causing violence. That is, different social and economic classes in society expose people to different levels and intensities of shame, humiliation, and disrespect, and are therefore more likely to result in violence. So what Gilligan is saying, I mean, going back to the main psychological point is that the difference between people who are shamed and violent and those who are shamed and not violent is that those who are shamed and not violent have other sources of self-esteem, whereas those who are shamed and violent have run out of or do not have other sources of self-esteem. And what he's saying in point 5 here on this sheet is that socioeconomic conditions differ in terms of what they offer for both their capacity to shame and their capacity to offer other sources of self-esteem. So one of the points that he makes is that on in paragraph paragraph 47 in the reading is he says he he's talked about this puzzle, and he says there's a puzzle that it has always seemed that or has been known for a long time that poor people are more violent than people who are not poor. And so he says in uh, um, paragraph 47 in the reading, he says, the puzzle I'm referring to is this. It has been known for millennia that individual or interpersonal violence, i.e., murder and other acts of violence that have been defined as crimes by the ruling class of any given society, are strongly associated with poverty, i.e., with the so-called lower classes. Long before there were statistical demonstrations of this association, both Plato and Aristotle said that poverty is the mother of crime. And so the point is that it is more likely that poor people are violent and engage in criminal behavior than non-poor people or middle class or wealthy people, as those crimes are defined by the ruling class. And there's a whole issues with those that I won't get into. Um, so why is that? Why is it that poor people tend to be more violent and engage in more criminal behavior? And there are all sorts of ways that are traditional answers to that. But in paragraph 48, Gilligan says the problem with seeing poverty or racial discrimination as causing crime and upper social status as providing immunity against it is that even though there is a demonstrably higher incidence or probability of the kinds of violence that are defined as criminal in those groups that have lower social and economic status, it is just as true that most poor people and most African Americans, as being representative of a group of people that have been discriminated against, do not commit such crimes, and that some, although fewer, members of upper status groups do commit them. How can all this be that poverty and discrimination cause violence? And so he's saying that it is the case that poor people and African Americans and Hispanics and several other groups are more likely to be violent and more likely to engage in criminal behavior. He also, I want to point out, does point out that it is not race as such, it is not ethnicity as such that causes crime. It is that being a member of a social group that is discriminated against, that causes shame, and that shame does tend to result in more violent behavior. In other words, racism is intended to, and it does result in shaming a group or a class or category of people. And because it shames that category of people as being members of that category, um, because it shames them, that and because shame tends to uh, be one of the two major factors in violence, those categories who are the targets of discrimination are shamed, and therefore have more shame as a social group that they deal with. I mean, that's one aspect of that. And I want to read paragraph 49. He actually says it more clear than I'm saying it here. He says in paragraph 49, the theory I am proposing here suggests a solution to that puzzle, namely that it is not poverty, nor even relative poverty, relative deprivation per se that causes violence. More poor people become violent, and more people who are members of the category of being discriminated against, races and ethnicities that are discriminated against, become violent, although most do not, because being poor and being the target, being the recipient of discrimination, increases the probability in a statistical sense that one will be exposed to higher frequencies and intensities of insult and contempt, of being humiliated and treated as inferior, as compared with those of upper social status, and that therefore there will be a higher risk of being overwhelmed by feelings of shame and not having available to oneself those other sources of pride and self-esteem, such as money, power, and social prestige, which can serve as alternatives to violence in satisfying the universal need for self-respect and respect from others. Um, what the point is here is that Gilligan is saying that the groups that are targeted in our society, and in any given society, and they differ per society, it's not necessarily the same groups, although it is true that one consistent group in societies are poor people, that those groups that are poor and therefore targeted because they are poor, lower class, as Gilligan points out, um, or groups that are targeted for discrimination, they experience shame as poor and shame as discriminated against. And it's not that poverty causes violence or some racial characteristic causes violence, is that poor people are shamed as being poor, and that shame tends to result in violence, and people who are discriminated against are shamed, and that shame that they experience tends to result in more violence. And so you get these social and economic categories that are more likely to be violent because they are the targets of shame. They are the targets of ridicule and humiliation. And I should say, in the terms that I've been talking about it, they are made to feel, and they are shown even, that they are powerless. And there is the experience of being more of more powerlessness among poor people, among targets of discrimination. Um, and that those feelings then are one of the two major contributing factors to violence. And so let's go back to the equation. The equation is that shame plus no other sources of self-esteem, or shame plus running out of other sources of self-esteem, equals violence. Um, uh, um, not everybody who is shamed is violent, because most people have other sources of self-esteem. People who are violent are both shamed and they run out of other sources of self-esteem. So what Gilligan is saying is that people who are the targets of racism and discrimination, people who are poor, they are shamed. I mean, those are shaming factors in society. And they are built up that way. They are structured into society to be more shamed. Um, So they're both more shame. So they come into the equation experiencing more shame, greater intensities of shame, and longer periods of shame than other groups in society. So they feel more shame. But the other part, that's the first part of the equation, shame plus. But the plus is that people who are discriminated against and people who are poor have fewer sources of self-esteem, and they run out of sources of self-esteem. So if you are poor, you are shamed, but you also have less money, for instance, as being poor, to spend on gaining sources of self-esteem. In other words, gaining sources of placing yourself in the world. Paragraph 31, of achieving things, of contributing to society in some recognized way. I mean, wealth offers you, money offers you paths into achievement. Poverty prevents or puts up barriers to achievement. And coupled with shame and greater intensities of shame, being poor and being discriminated against um, tend to result in violence. So it's more violence. So it's not that poverty causes shame. It's not that some racial characteristic or ethnic characteristic. I'm sorry. It's not that poverty causes violence. It's not that some racial or ethnic characteristic causes violence. It's that poverty and racial characteristics are more shamed. Certain racial characteristics and ethnic characteristics are more shamed, and they offer fewer sources of self-esteem. Um, and those two together are the equation, as it will, for violence. Shame plus running out of other sources of self-esteem result in violence. This is a really important concept here because it is the case that even though it is more likely that poor people are violent, it is also more likely that most poor people are not violent. Why? Because most poor people still have other sources of self-esteem. But it is true that poor people tend to run out of sources of self-esteem more and paths to self-esteem more and achievement more than people who are not poor. So not it is the case that more that not all poor people are violent because most poor people have other sources of self-esteem, but it is more likely that poor people run out of other sources of self-esteem, coupled with the more intense shame they experience. Um, it is also true that most targets of discrimination, most people who have been victims, who belong to groups that have been victimized through having racial or ethnic characteristics, um, it is true that they tend to be more violent than people without those characteristics, those racial or ethnic characteristics, because people with uh, uh, um, racial characteristics are more shamed in a culture. But most people who are victims of discrimination, of whatever kind it is, still have sources of self-esteem. But it is more likely that people with in groups having racial characteristics that are discriminated against or ethnic characteristics, they have fewer paths to self-esteem. And so you see this phenomenon of greater violence among poor people and victims of discrimination, not because they're poor directly and not because they have certain racial characteristics, but, but because it is more shaming and they, in community terms, are prevented from the paths of self-esteem and achievement that people without those characteristics, whether it's poverty or racial characteristics, have. I know this sounds confusing. I'm not being as clear as I could be on it, but I think the point ultimately is clear. It's shame that's the um, major cause of violence, but not by itself. It is shame plus running those sources of self-esteem indicated in paragraph 31. And the way that society runs, shame and other paths to self-esteem are distributed in a given community differently depending on how that community is structured. In the United States, we have certain targets of discrimination and racism. In the United States, we treat poor people in certain ways. We produce poor people, more poor people than most other cultures. We produce more wealthy people, but we produce many more poor people. By our economic and social structure. And these are not controversial aspects of our society. I mean, you can see this statistically, and the United States is well beyond most other societies in creating systems of economic poverty and certain kinds of racial and ethnic characteristics that are discriminated against. But they do. But it certainly is in other societies. Canada has its share of violence. France has its share of violence. India, England, and so on. But what Gilligan is saying is that you'll see those people who are violent having being placed in similar positions in their communities, in their nations, in terms of being more shamed and having fewer opportunities of achievement. And so the result is more violence. I hope that's clear. I mean, these are delicate issues, frankly, and so it's important that you get these straight. I think what I'm going to do here is take another break and end this part, and then come back with part 3, which is the 6th point in that single sheet, and is on page 12 and 13 in the reading. I will be back, well, soon for you, because I'm just going to stop it.